Welcome to the Untangling Prayer Podcast with Rachel Wojo, where you'll find the space to clear your head and calm your heart. I'm so glad you're here. Make yourself at home. It's Rachel Wojo here. Thanks so much for being with me today. I grew up in the middle of nowhere, Richwood, West Virginia, and it just so happens that a new friend of mine did the same. Today, I'm sharing with you Mary Marantz and her interview with me on how to pray when you don't have the words to say. I hope you enjoy it. To ensure that you're still believing that God has a plan and a purpose for you, that your life means something and that your life matters, the only way you can try to logic your way all the way through it all day long, but the only way that I've found is that by believing by faith that God's glory and my good are never separated. They're always together.
You're listening to the Mary Marantz Show, a space to own the muddy parts of your story, build things that matter, and where slow growth equals strong roots. Listen in for honest conversations about business, relationships, faith, goals, and more, where we feel the fear and move forward anyway. Here's your host, Mary Marantz.
Rachel Wojo, as I love to call you. That's not your full last name. You'll introduce us to that in a second. But Rachel Wojo is in the house. First time on the Mary Marantz Show. But I feel like I've known you forever, both because we are in a mastermind together for authors. And also we discovered through that and a little bit before through, I think maybe like, you seeing Dirt. We grew up in the same small town.
It's crazy.
What are the odds of that?
It's so crazy. Yeah. And I just happen to be that much older than you, that our paths really didn't cross when we were growing up. And that's what's so crazy is usually in a small town, your paths cross frequently. And for us, It was just enough of a span that we didn't discover that until we were both authors.
Yeah. Wild. Two Richwood girls who became authors. What are the odds of that? And then I actually, just as we're recording this, had the huge, honor and joy of getting to hang out with you here in my house in Connecticut. You came up to spend a full day of coaching as we plotted out some big plans for getting ready for bringing this book into the world. Desperate Prayers is coming out, as this is airing 1 week from today. And, you say in the book, would you recognize your miracle if it came packaged a little differently than you anticipated? This kind of idea of seeing other people have huge breakthroughs, or maybe you're looking in the Bible and you're seeing Red Seas being parted and you say, well, does that still happen today? Like, do we get miracles like that? Because it doesn't feel like it, right? It feels like just quiet. And you actually did a poll for your audience recently where you found like the number one thing they're struggling with right now is, tell me if I'm getting this right, not even that they aren't hearing God. Like they're not even sure God is hearing them.
Exactly. Yeah. It's crazy because in our culture today, Christians, I think most of us feel like we know by now, oh, God is there and he hears me. But the biggest doubt that people have is whether or not they're just speaking into space.
Yeah. And you, going back to the quote I just shared from the book, would you recognize your miracle if it came packaged a little differently? It kind of reminds me of this story that I think has been told a few different ways. I saw it on a Hallmark Christmas movie with Candace Cameron Bure, the Shoe Addicts Christmas, where it's talking about somebody's like basically stuck in the snow and they're freezing to death and a snowplow comes along and they're like, no, waiting on God to save me. And like, a helicopter comes along. No, waiting for God to save me. And, like 3 different methods come by to save this person stuck in the snow. And then they freeze to death and they get to heaven and they're like, why didn't you answer my prayer? And he's like, I sent you a snowplow, a helicopter, like a rescue team, St. Bernard's. What more did you want from me? And it is that idea of sometimes we can get so fixed on how we think the prayer should be answered that we miss that it has in fact been answered.
Right. It is true. And I think that for me, I learned so much about how prayer really works that I just had to write this book to share that very thing, that the miracles don't often happen the way that we think they should. But do we have our eyes open wide enough to be able to see them when they come into our lives. And that, I think, is the crux of the struggle.
Yeah. And let's talk about a really good example of that from the book, where most people would say, my eyes would have to be open pretty wide to see that as a gift. You talk about, I think this was maybe like a little ways into the pandemic, that your husband came home one day and had very unexpectedly lost his job. A person who has never lost a job before in his life, was like always the, super reliable one, always the favorite employee or what have you, comes home, and that kicked off an 8-month wilderness season in your family of him not being able to find work throughout the pandemic. And you say that was actually an answer to a prayer, a miracle. And I'm like, okay, we're going to need you to unpack that for us. Like, how holy do you have to be like, thank you, Lord, for this 8-month, uncertainty in your finances. So just maybe for those of us who are not quite so quick to see the miracle, unpack that for us. How was that a miracle?
Well, God and I have quite a history together in regards to prayer, because I learned early on in my life to take everything to Him. And especially in my 20s, came down to making the decision, do I believe God or not? And you and I chatted about that a little bit on Friday, of how we come to that place in our lives where we have to choose. Do I believe God exists, or does He not? And if He does exist, does He care about me? Does He really care about my little, in quote, prayers? And how much does He care, and how intimate is He? So when my husband came home and said, I lost my job today, I had been praying for about 2 years that his job would change. And so rather than taking this moment of, oh my gosh, my husband lost his job, what are we going to do? Not that I didn't have those thoughts. Those thoughts did come. But I think the primary thought was just believing God, to know and trust in Him, and to say, I've been praying that his job would change, so this must mean the change is coming. Now, I didn't know in that moment that it was going to be an 8-month journey. Most of us know financially that 8 months is a long time to be unemployed. And so that 8 months, there were a lot of highs and lows of going to God in prayer and saying, hello, do you still see me down here? Do you still see our family? And just continually going to Him and asking that question. So I wouldn't say I was all that holy at the beginning. I just knew the history, that I had been praying for a change, and this seemed like the signal for that change.
Yeah, I love that. Something that kind of came up for me as you were talking is, I remember seeing a post from Stephen Pressfield, who writes incredible posts on Instagram, by the way. Everybody go check them out, especially for those of us who want to be writers who are writers. And he was talking about, in that particular post, about when he looks backwards through his life, all of those times when some major level up happened in his life or his career, or where he was being positioned, immediately preceding them, and for extended periods of time, was a wilderness season.
Right.
It was a season of being brought off by himself. It was a season of isolation. It was a season where maybe relationships, all sort of fell down, like these dominoes falling down, all at once. Or it was, maybe a financial wilderness or whatever. He didn't specifically say the financial one, but it is this sort of idea of like, there is a testing, and a refinement, and a quieting of the noise that maybe has been taking up a little too much of our bandwidth before something good is coming. But I'm just curious as to your take on that, because I think it can become a little too tempting to kind of tie a bow on everything hard that happens and go, it's for my good, or there must be something really good coming. And for a lot of people listening, they have been in an extended wilderness,
right,
as you have lived. A lot of us feel like it was 2019 and we blinked, and now it's somehow the end of 2024 and we're still buffering, right? We're still trying to even get caught up, let alone think about a new year. And there's a danger of like Christian platitudes, where sometimes, and like we talked about Christianese when you were here on Friday, it's a little too tempting to say like, oh, like, if you are faithful enough, or, oh, if you pray enough, or, oh, if you do this enough, then really, really good things will always come out of really hard things. And I know that is not what you are specifically about. And that's not what you're saying here. So just take a second and talk to the person listening who is like, I am at the end of my desperate wilderness rope. And like, I've been saying the prayers and I've been doing the things and it's not changing. It's just not. And so what does it look like to kind of be in that for the long road?
Yeah. It is hard. I look at these characters in the Bible and you look at from the time that they were called or told they were supposed to do something until the time it came to fruition, like Moses and David, there were years and years, decades between when they were told they were supposed to do something or when something good was going to take place and then when it actually happened. Abraham comes to mind, the promise of a child. He's 100, his wife's 99, and still no child. You know, what are the odds? And so our lives do consist of these long periods of time, like you said, the wilderness that God uses. I guess I would say to the person who is in that season right now, do everything you can to hold on. I heard Granger Smith say this week, he kind of gave this analogy, you know, he lost a child to a pool accident. And he gave this analogy to a woman that he was sharing with. And he said, when you're in the storm, when you're in the wilderness, like you just said, if you're in a storm, you don't go out in the storm and try to cover up your rose bushes and say, oh, my precious rose bushes, I need to save you. Or you don't go out and dig them up and try to bring them in the house. You hunker down. And you wait until that storm is over. You stay inside and you cook yourself a pot of soup and you just hold on until the wind has stopped blowing, until the rain has stopped coming. And so that's what I would encourage you to do. If you're in this wilderness, you're struggling right now, you just need to hold on. You need to hold on. And I would say you need to hold on to God and get as close to him as you possibly can.
Well, that answer actually could not have teed up my next question better. So I know you have not been given these questions in advance. That's kind of a rule of mine. And so I think that's really cool when that lines up like that, is just this idea of these long gaps of time between you feel called to something and when it actually happens. And you have actually experienced getting your first traditionally published book 8 years ago. And then there being this 8-year gap in between the first and the second. And so you have known what it is to kind of have a prayer answered and then like sort of in one respect, immediately go back into a waiting wilderness season. And so I know there are a lot of people listening to this show who either want to write a book or maybe are actively writing or maybe are in the process of writing their first book. And actively writing for themselves or actively writing for the book, whatever. And so just talk a little bit about, but just sort of like the real world, like what happens when we stop being polite, we start getting real. Like give us that take on those 8 years, both the like parts that were really frustrating to you, like God, really, I was faithful, I did this, and like you've put me right back into waiting.
Right.
And then being in the thick of releasing a book that is the fruit of those 8 years of waiting.
So what
has made you better and what was really hard about it?
Oh boy. So Mary likes to ask the hard questions. Let's just say that way. I think when you have a book released, everyone sort of believes that then you will be able to write and continuously write and crank out a book a year and you'll become this New York Times bestseller right away. And most of us sort of like the part of the Bible that says, and suddenly, because we think, oh yes, God did something and it just happened. But what we fail to realize about the and suddenly is that there was this journey before that took us there to prepare us. And so I guess in my thought, as a writer, just to speak to your writers in your community, it was not an easy journey for me emotionally to be patient, to wait for the right time, to initially, after my first book launched, I pitched and I was unsuccessful with those pitches. Those book proposals went nowhere. They got shot down by the agent, by the publisher who was advising me. And so I was back to square one. And in that moment, I was like, okay, Lord, if now is not the right time, help me understand that now is not the right time. And so it was not very patiently that I waited. I pushed. I did not pitch any more proposals, however, because I knew that in my personal situation, my family needed me. My special needs daughter needed me. There were things that had to be done that no one else could do. As the mom of a special needs child who's terminally ill, there are just things that no one else can do other than mom. And so I'm grateful that the Lord showed me that that was not a good season for me to continue to push the writing. Now, I continued to serve my community with material content, the blog. I started podcasting. There are many things that I did during that season to continue to produce content, to hone my skills, to work at both the writing and speaking. But I had to be content that it was not the right season for me and be okay with the fact that sometimes you have an 8-year gap, and that's okay. That's just the individual plan for you. And every person as a writer, every writer's journey is unique.
Yeah. That actually kind of brings me to, if the got what you want and then are plunged back into a season of long stretch of waiting, a wilderness. I'm not hearing anything. Is God hearing me? That's one form of like where these desperate prayers can arise. Another one you talk about, I kind of labeled in my notes, the boulder rolls back down the mountain kind of feeling, because this is what my third book is all about. It's like for those of us who kind of keep starting over, like, why is it so easy for other people? They execute, they implement, they achieve what? Like it's hard, Elwood style. Meanwhile, we keep starting over, shrinking, sabotaging. We blink at the last moment as we push that boulder up the hill and it rolls all the way back down the mountain. We lose our grip, we lose our way. It rolls all the way back down the mountain. And you say, when familiar, distressing circumstances arise, have you ever prayed, God, why am I in this situation again?
Yeah.
And it kind of in my book 3, I talk about this concept of like, we repeat the lesson until it is learned, only we never seem to learn it. Why? Yeah. And so, in your book, there's a part where you talk about, you're referencing John 9:1-5. The disciples ask about a blind man and they say, who sinned? Yeah. Who caused this man to be born blind? The man or his parents? Like somebody had to do something wrong. And, I really resonate with that, because when I look around and I see people who are just blowing up, right? Like they're those weeds kind of exploding overnight. I talk about in Slow Growth Equals Strong Roots, the weeds, the flowers, and the trees. And I know from interactions that I've had that they're sort of cutting the corners, or they're taking the shortcuts, or they're not doing everything fully with integrity, whatever. And I feel like I'm walking through a hurricane in molasses. There is that tendency to go, listen, this is not how the economy of God should work. Those of us who are doing it right and well and good should be succeeding, and those who aren't should be the ones who are stuck. And it's just not, it's in this world, that's just not how it is. So, this is not really like a huge life-changing question, but maybe it is, or maybe it's too big of a question, but what do we do about that?
Yeah.
What do we do about that human tendency to go, who sinned? Because bad things are happening, and they must be righteous because good things are happening to them.
So this is a conversation my husband and I have quite often, because he is the logical one of the two of us, and he likes for everything to be square, and for everything to match up, and for everything to be aligned. And the bubble always has to be in the middle. I mean, that's just his mentality. And so the two of us will often go back and forth about what's faith and what's logic. And so what I always say to him is, faith is sometimes recognizing that God is in control and we are not, and that his plan is not something we're always privy to this side of heaven. Like, we're not going to get those answers, those why answers, those hard answers of why suffering, why disease, why death, why me, all of those answers. we are not going to always get those answers on this planet. We won't know the answers until the afterlife, until heaven. And so being content with the fact that our mind is only so big and can only hold so much has to be a realization for us. I think that's a part of really, I guess, God created me with just a hair of naivety, which is enough to make me not want to be as logical as others maybe. And I think that allows me to have this deep faith and deep relationship with the Lord that just says, you know what? I know the end of myself. I've been on desperation row. I have been to the rock bottom of the barrel. And I know that the only way out of that is by looking up. And so I've just focused on asking the Lord, like, look, I'm desperate. Desperation fuels this dependence on God like nothing else can. And so you have to choose, am I going to allow that to push me to God, or will it turn me away? And then I was talking yesterday to my oldest daughter, and I said, there is the land in between those two places. So some people, run away from God. They're frustrated. They get mad. They, don't want to have anything to do with God at all. The others run to God and they're like, hold me, God, hold me. But then there's this middle ground that I think a lot of us take, and I've taken it, where you stiff arm God. So you want him close enough to where if you really need him, he's there, but you also want to keep him far enough away because you're angry. Wow. And I think that little middle ground is where so many of us actually struggle. That's where so many of us really struggle.
Wow, that's good. Desperation row is a new phrase in my vocabulary now. That's so good. Desperation row, all of that was so good. Bouncing back up to that scripture I just referenced, we come back to Jesus's answer, and he says, neither. He was born this way, so that God's work could be displayed in him. Man, do I struggle with that. On the one hand, it's like, oh, of course, the easy, let it all be to God's glory. Like all of these things that, listen, for everybody listening, maybe you're listening for one of the first times. I have a deep faith. I'm also super analytical, went to law school, have a master's in philosophy and undergrad in philosophy. And I really like to go, well, hold on a minute. Is this really what was being said? So is there a part of you, Rachel, that struggles with that as an explanation? Oh, God just did that so that he could kind of show off what he can do in his life. Okay, thanks. Is there a part of you that's like, wait a minute, what is the character of God that this suffering is not only allowed, but actually we think probably woven into this person from birth, right? That this was, we don't know if they were blinded later in life or from birth, so that God could display his works.
Yeah.
That's hard.
Right.
That's hard of the character of God that I know.
Right.
Right. So riff on that for a little while.
I would say my response is yes, I see where you're coming from with that for sure. Because to think that, oh, are we just God's puppets? That's kind of where our brain goes when we think about that. But I really believe with all my heart that not only is it for God's glory, but it's also for our good. And what I have seen with struggle, what I have seen with the fire when we're walking through it, is that we come out on the other side more pure, more of the person that God sees us to be when he created us. And so it's for our good and his glory, not separated from each other, but together. Those are happening at the same time. I wouldn't want anything to change. And the really hard stuff that I have walked through. I wouldn't want any of that to change simply because I recognize that God doesn't just want to give us the answer to our prayers. He just doesn't want to give us this easy life on this planet. We're fighting against sin nature. We're fighting against the war that was started when Adam and Eve chose to allow sin to enter into the world. And so by fighting that whole battle, in the process of that, if we also fight the struggle, what happens is we often turn to thinking that the struggle is from God and forget that He allows the struggle. He allows the struggle. So the struggle is His gift to us, essentially. I just know, Mary, the kind of person I was before I had a special needs child. And you know this about me. I grew up in a Christian home, a Christian school. I had awesome parents who both worked really hard for our family. And I feel so blessed. And it wasn't until I entered college, graduated, taught in Christian school, got married to a pastor who then had an affair for 4 of the 5 years that we were married. So when I look back on that season, and during that time, my daughter Taylor was born to me as a special needs child. So instead of the white picket fence, I wound up a single mom of a special needs child. Nowhere where I've ever dreamed that I would be. And so if you want to say, well, that was for God's glory, I think I'm on your side of the fence. We had that's a pretty painful way to get to God's glory. And so I would look back on that now, though, all these over 20 years later, and say the kind of person that I was then is not the person that I am now. And if I hadn't experienced that journey and had my eyes open to the lessons that God was teaching me, even in the pain and through the suffering and through the struggling, then I'm not sure I would be able to even be in front of you today. I really don't. Wow. Because when you watch your child suffer and die, then the next day you have to get up and say, okay, I did not die when my daughter died. God has a plan for me. And so to ensure that you're still believing that God has a plan and a purpose for you, that your life means something and that your life matters, the only way you can try to logic your way all the way through it all day long. But the only way that I've found is that by believing by faith that God's glory and my good are never separated. They're always together.
Wow. That's good. That's so good.
As women, we're pulled in every direction, and we often put pressure on ourselves to do all and be all. We may feel overwhelmed or isolated and wonder, is it just me? Do other women feel this way too? God Hears Her from Our Daily Bread Ministries is a community of women who, through honest conversations, personal stories, and biblically based resources, encounter God's grace and flourish together as a sisterhood in Christ. Visit GodHearsHer.org to experience podcasts, blogs, devotionals, and more that encourage us to lean on Jesus, the one who turns life's messiness into meaning. Again, that's GodHearsHer.org.
Let's dig in a little bit to get a kind of a working definition, a little bit of what desperate prayers are and what they aren't. In other words, when we're talking about coming to the end of our rope, and what that does to us in terms of our relationship with God, you're pretty clear throughout the book of some things they shouldn't be. So, for example, you say it's so easy to use desperate cries to God as last measure prayers. And it's not one of your sort of pet peeve one-liners you hear people say is all we can do is pray. And you say, it's not all we can do is pray. The best thing we can do is pray. And let's do that first, basically. To kind of contrast that with that, or sort of balance all of this out, you also talk about, there's the negotiating prayer, which I've super done. I felt my toes were stepped all over with this one. The formula of God, if you'll just fill in the blank, then I'll fill in the blank. Yeah. It's these are the terms of our agreement. And then one kind of final type of prayer to kind of say this is not it. It's not the last measure or like, this is all I can do, so I guess I'll do it. It's not the formula prayer, and it's also not the checking boxes prayer. And you use the kind of Israelites to give that example with fasting. So kind of tell us a little bit about what is a checking the box sort of prayer?
I think we've all been guilty of that one, where we just, we say, okay, if I do this, this, and this, then God will do this, this, and this. And so we say, if I read my Bible, and if I pray every day, and if I am the good Christian, then God is going to do X, Y, and Z for me. And then we go a little bit further with it, and we think that, we want God's blessing. And so we do those things because we want God's blessing. And so if you look at that story of the children of Israel, it's pretty crazy. They're doing these things. They're praying, they're fasting, they're doing all of these things. And they go to God and they say, how come we aren't experiencing healing? Like, why are we having these struggles? Because we're doing everything that you told us to do. And God says to them, look at your heart. That's where the problem is. The problem is that you want the blessings more than you want me. And I think that that's the issue, the crux of what I really want to share in Desperate Prayers, is that the power of prayer is not in our words or our fluffy, beautiful liturgies, although, I love liturgies, but the power is not necessarily in the format or the style or all the these and the thous. It's the heart that God is after. That's what he's really after. And he wants to give us so much more than the answers to our prayers. He wants to be the answer to our prayers. There's a huge difference.
Wow. A lot of that kind of like, I think about the Israelites fasting and that sort of like, look at what we are doing. You say though, like an underlying, like deeper root of that is a very human need that we all have. And it's this idea for humans to need, you say humans need to feel affirmed, to be seen in both their pain and their pleasure, right? That you talk about teaching your kids to ride a bike. And when they finally are doing it and they're cruising down the street, it's not just, oh, I have freedom. Look at what I'm doing. I was successful. It's like, look at me doing this thing. And talking about that idea of this God who sees us, you tell us a little bit about Hagar's story, and this new name that she gave to God.
Yeah. She went into the wilderness 2 times. And I guess I relate to her because she was a single mom and she was sent away from her husband and his primary wife and sent into the wilderness with her child to die. The first time that she went into the wilderness, she ran away. The second time she was sent away. So again, an example of someone who had more than one wilderness and who had to figure out how to work with it both times. But because God heard her cry. And I think it's so interesting. We don't really have the words to a prayer. There were no these and thous listed in that passage. It was just her crying and her son crying, and God heard their cries. And so she came to the realization when the angel came to visit her, God sees me. And she gave a name to God that no one else in the Bible has ever listed again. And it was Elroy, the God who sees me. So many of us want that intimacy. We want to know that God sees us, that he cares about us, that he loves us. We want that, but we struggle with just understanding what's happening around us in the culture, in the world, in our society, in our personal circumstances. We really struggle. And so I think the example of Hagar is just recognizing that God does see you. I say that at the end of my podcast every time. God sees you, God hears you, and he knows your need. And I hope that those who are listening today are catching that I believe that with all of my heart. I believe the Bible supports that. And just being reminded of God's promises, if you have chosen to believe them, then being reminded of them is where you'll find that affirmation that God sees you, God hears you, and he knows your needs.
Yeah. You know what I think is so powerful about that is like the number one thing we need to know is to feel seen and to feel heard by God to the point of we're going to give him name, the God who sees us. And yet the number one answer to your poll was God apparently can't hear me anymore. I don't know what I'm saying wrong. I don't know like where the signals are getting crossed. I don't know, like, maybe I'm using too much Riz and, Gen Z, whatever. Anyway, like I think that that's really interesting to be attacked at the very core human need that God is wanting, right? He's like, if you go all the way back to the garden, I want to see you. I want to know you. I want to hear you, like nothing separating us. And so you actually talk about this concept of spiritual separation anxiety. Tell us a little bit about what that is. And like, what do you think is the biggest, attack or the biggest, like, trigger, for lack of a better word, of that anxiety in 2024? Like where are we feeling that, God's far away from me?
Yeah. I think when we can't see how he's working. So we want to trust, we can't see God. That's obvious. We can see him in nature. So walking out in nature is a tremendous way to begin to feel that I'm seeing God because he has created everything. That's an incredible way. But one of the other things I think we want to see is, and know that he sees us, is through our circumstances. And when our circumstances don't change, they stay the same forever and ever, and they're terrible circumstances, and they haven't changed, then I think that we just really want God. We want to know that he sees us, he hears us. And so to open our eyes to what he has for us, to open our eyes to be able to see, Lord, how are you working? Not just see me, but show me how you're working so that I can have that affirmation in my spirit. I think when we spend the time with him to ask him those questions and we're sincere, he sees our hearts and he starts to reveal things to us. And Mary, from reading the book, God has done incredible things for me. He has shown me that he answers my prayers. He has shown me ways that he is moving and working and opened my eyes to those things. And my daughters will even say, they're like, Mom, why did these things only happen to you? And I'm like, sweetie, they happen to everybody. It's just whether or not we're open enough to be able to see what God is doing. And so I think that's an important part of it, is just that yielding and surrender to him and strengthening that relationship, which only comes with consistency. I mean, from your husband, right? Your relationship with your husband, you have different levels of conversation. You have this is what I need from the grocery store. And then you have this is what I need from you. This is, those are two totally different conversations. And I think until we have a variety of conversations with God on those different levels, then it's difficult for us to begin to bring the relationship to a solid place.
Yeah. You say in the book, talking about Hagar and talking about, the second time she's in the wilderness, she needs water. Her baby needs water. Like, it's getting very dire, very desperate. And then all of a sudden, she can open her eyes and she can see it. You say the water, what she needed to survive, was available all along. She just hadn't seen it. Did the tears in her eyes block the view of an oasis? Ooh, is that a good line? Ooh, is that a good line? Did the tears in her eyes block the view of an oasis? Had the sense of being overwhelmed by her circumstances prevented her from seeing the provision God had prepared for her? And you say, this woman experienced being heard and seen by her Creator and no longer questioned his existence, right? After calling him the God who sees me and after seeing this provision, this woman experienced being heard and seen by her Creator and no longer questioned his existence. And I just wrote down in my notes, we are not that good at that, are we? I know that I am not that good at that sometimes. Like, I have this whole track record of history and faithfulness with God that I can point to. And yet today, I think we're starting back over at zero, right? Every single time. So a really good quote I heard once was, God's past faithfulness demands our present trust. Audrey Roloff said that a mentor of hers shared that with her. And I just think that's so beautiful. But myself, I'll raise my hand first. And a lot of us are not so good at that. And so I want to kind of like, you had mentioned this kind of in passing, but I want to dig into it now for a second. You had $5,000 of proof dropped into your backyard of God's faithfulness. I wasn't 100% sure. Was this in the middle of the 8-month wilderness with your husband losing his job, or just tell us a little bit about what happened there?
So that's a great question, because the wilderness was what I thought was over. It did not happen in the middle of that 8 months. We were down to, my husband had actually found a contract job and he was back to work, and he was on his first day back to work. And so honestly, I thought in my mind, okay, God, you've answered our prayer. You put him back to work. And so he had this opportunity, and it felt like there's some light at the end of the tunnel here, right? And so that night I was standing in the kitchen after a long day, and I got this text. And this text was like, Rachel, a friend wants to give you a gift. Go out to your backyard and look for a yellow envelope underneath the green balance beam. I'm like, okay, what's happening here? Is this for real? And
I love when you're like, should I get my pepper spray?
Yes. I'm thinking, okay, maybe we really should get a backdoor ring doorbell at this point. But I thought, no, this has to be for real. And so I went back and looked and pulled out this yellow envelope and immediately took it to my husband in the garage. And my hands were shaking. And I'm just like, what in the world is happening here? And I open it up and I push the text towards him. He reads the text, and then I read to him what the letter inside the yellow envelope says. And it says, Matt, Rachel, and family, our God sees you. Nothing escapes his notice. This is a reward of your faithfulness from his faithfulness. And it said, the angel of the Lord found you in the wilderness. Not signed, typed, no name, no signature. And so a second envelope was inside the yellow envelope. And that envelope was a bank envelope. So we opened it and I pulled out this stack of cash and started to fan it out. And the first 5 were $20 bills, but then every bill after that was a $100 bill. Someone had left $5,000 in our backyard, and I knew that someone was God.
Yeah. Such a cool story, first of all. And like this, like hashtag goals to be able to be that kind of radically generous, right? Like that's so fun. When we were together we did our mastermind of authors did a retreat in North Carolina a couple months ago. And one of the funny things that kind of came up in conversation is that with my coaching clients, I will often do this high five hand slap thing to mark when they're playing small. So it's like Liz Lemon worthy, like self high five, just to kind of like mark it. I want you to hear it. It's like dog training 101. It's like, boom, right? Like, I want you to hear what you just said. And so something that I think is so fascinating is that there's a part, maybe just a little bit later in the book, where you said, now I'm not banking on that happening again. And I went like this. So I was reading it, because I think this is an interesting part here, right? So you have a track record of seeing God's incredible faithfulness. And you're writing so passionately to us to say, like, listen, like, God hears your prayers and he shows up. And then there's just that tendency to go like that, don't get your hopes up sort of feeling, right? And so I was thinking about that. Like, what is the balance between confidence in what God has done before and will do again, and not giving way to entitlement, which is, I think, what I'm hearing from that sentence is like, listen, I'm not saying God's going to drop $5,000 in my yard every time things get a little hard. So for us, what is it to be like bold in our confidence that God will come through without feeling entitled to the outcome we expect?
Yeah. So I think that goes back to how we opened the conversation about how hard it is to we have this expectation of how God will work. We have this expectation of X plus Y equals Z. This is how God's prayers work, and this is how the faith works. And honestly, I just think the Lord wants to shake all that up and say, you don't know me. I'm the most creative God that there is. I just want to show you how creative I can be. And it wouldn't be a miracle if it were repeated in the same way every time, right? It would be cliche. And so I think part of the preservation of not giving us that same thing, walking that balance of, I believe who God is and I'm confident that he says he will do what he will do. But I also believe that we can't put God in a box and we can't have this limitation of expectation. And if God chooses to put $5,000 in my backyard, whoopee, I am going to be excited and maybe I'll write another book about it. But I have a feeling that instead, when you look at the prayers that God answered for people in the Old Testament, many of them were one-time answers. The day the sun stood still. Has it ever happened again? No, it happened one time for Joshua on one day in history. And so my answer prayers are not going to look like someone else's. My intimate conversations with God aren't going to look like someone else's. And so my prayer, as people hear that, it's that, it's almost like, I think I may have used this analogy when we were talking before about how I don't really feel like it's a scale where you can balance one hand against the other. It's more like a circular wheel that's going around. And at the top, you may have some peaks of understanding, and then that understanding may drop down to the bottom, and then you have a fresh revelation, something else new that comes up. So to expect the Lord to answer the same way every time, I don't think that there's anything wrong with that necessarily. I just think that our God is creative and he can work beyond that.
Love that. Love that so much. I'm ready now to talk about Taylor. You've mentioned and alluded to Taylor a few times. You say you had a child with what is called Alzheimer's of childhood. Can you just tell us a little bit about her story and, for anybody who's maybe finding you for the first time, like what you were up against?
Sure. So I briefly mentioned her diagnosis, mucopolysaccharidosis, a rare metabolic disorder that is neurologically degenerative. And Taylor received that diagnosis at age 4. After my mom had passed away, she received that diagnosis, and it was a very difficult diagnosis to wrap your head around because the average lifespan is 10 to 15 years. You see this bubbly, happy, joyful, talkative, hyper, moving child, and you think, how is that ever going to happen? You can't even put yourself in the mindset of being able to understand it. And so the journey that would then take place from the time that Taylor was 4, where she began to lose skills and gradually lost every skill until January 2nd, 2019, when God called her home to heaven. So that journey, not sure if I'm doing a very good job describing it in a nutshell, because I don't think that any of us are prepared to watch our loved ones suffer, and certainly not for 19 years.
Yeah. Yeah. And you do what is arguably the hardest thing to do. You were with a child on the day she was born, and you were with a child on the day that she died. And you talk about this, sort of van coming to get her. And that night, your husband said a sentence that just absolutely wrecked me in the book. What was that sentence?
He said, we're lying in bed and he's sobbing and I'm sobbing, and we're trying to deal with ourselves and the fact that what our ears were always peeled to hear, her sighs, her coughs, suddenly it was a total void. And he had carried her body down the stairs. The van had come and taken her away, and we're lying in bed. And he was just overcome and said, I feel like I'm supposed to go get her.
Wow.
It was what he had always done. He had always been the good father, the protective father, the caregiving father, the loving father, the dad who cleaned up the vomit and who cleaned up the shoes and who, just cared for her so beautifully in so many ways. that his mind, his protective nature that God had given him, could not reconcile with the current reality. And so this drive to just feel like he's supposed to go over to the funeral home and scoop her up won't be declined. It won't be ignored. And even just the fact that both of us could articulate that moment and endure that moment and then share that moment with so many people is mind-boggling in some ways. But I think the reason I share that is to help people understand that I do know what desperation looks like. I have seen it and I have experienced it.
Yeah, 100%. You kind of compare it or you bring up the imagery of the orca whale, the killer whale who lost a baby and pushed it for 17 days, far, far, far outside the norm of, whales are very communal in their pods and they display all sorts of emotions, but far, far, far outside the norm of experience, exhibiting or experiencing that kind of grief. And you say grief drives behaviors we can't rationalize. Sometimes we can't part with the protective intuitions God instilled in us. We feel compelled to keep doing what we've always done, denying the reality of loss. And of course, all of this is just bringing up all of these these very visceral images of how God must feel about us. I feel like I'm supposed to go get her. If you're listening to this right now and you were feeling so desperate and so lost, just know God is feeling like I would give anything to just scoop you up right now. And I think a really just full circle powerful moment. There's so much in the book, by the way. I feel like we're giving away so much good stuff, but there's so much in this book. Everybody needs to make sure you get a copy and just read the full story. But just give us a little glimpse of something very interesting that happened with her birth certificate right before this very, very hard day. This sort of I talked about birth to death and this idea of her birth certificate coming back around full circle right before.
Matt was Taylor's father all of those years, but he never carried the actual label of being her father because her birth father was in the picture and he always wanted to honor that. And as that faded, Taylor did not see her birth father from the time that she was age 11, 12 until she passed away. And so Matt came to me and asked, before Taylor became really sick and we didn't know she would be going to heaven so quickly, but he asked, is there a way that I can adopt Taylor? Now, mind you, Taylor is already 22 years old, but Matt just felt this overwhelming, compelling to make her his own with his last name. And I think a part of that was driven by the fact that we knew that we would be driving by a cemetery with her name on a headstone. And it did not feel right after all of those years of sacrifice and love to have a headstone where the name didn't match who she was. And so that was part of the drive behind that name change. So God worked a miracle. And Taylor was able to be adopted by Matt on December 31st, 2018, 2 days before she passed away. Wow. So when that birth certificate came in the mail, I had this I never knew this before, Mary. Maybe others listening will have known, but the birth certificate came in the mail and her name was on the birth certificate, Taylor Wojnarowski. And then after the birth certificate, it said in the lines following, Father Matthew Wojnarowski, Mother Rachel Wojnarowski. And the birth certificate had the date and the time that she was born. Essentially, what happens is the father is placed on that adoptive father is placed on that birth certificate as if he were there the day she was born.
Wow.
And so when you look at, you mentioned earlier, God is chasing us. He's pursuing us. He wants to scoop us up and love on us. That's his desire. That's how I feel about that certificate. He is always looking to push off that signature of Adam, the world of sin that we were born in, and instead usher in a new name for us, a name that he has called us since before we were created. And he welcomes us into his arms as the son or daughter of the King. And so I hope that adoption story is helpful to someone. Thank you for bringing that up and allowing me to share that.
Yeah. And speaking of the new name, what does that new name that she was given stand for?
Wojnarowski actually means warrior. That is. So Taylor was given Taylor the Warrior, the name of Taylor the Warrior, the name that she had lived her entire life.
Love that. I love that. And you write in the book this line, when control eludes our grasp, prayers ascend to fill the gap. And when you were here together, one of the things we were talking about is the class that you are putting together, free class you're going to be teaching, about how to become a prayer warrior for your family in very dark times. And it sort of kicks off, like this is a very small part of the class. I'm not going to give away much of the class. But it sort of kicks off with this idea of a lot of people, if they've been in the Christian world growing up and everything, they're familiar with this idea of putting on the armor of God, preparing yourself to go to battle, to be that warrior. And you say we actually miss out on two words at the end. Like we talk about the breastplate and the helmet and the sword and the belts and all these things, but there are two words at the end that get just skipped right over. And so what are those words? And what does that tell us about going into battle in 2024?
Yeah, that end of the passage in Ephesians 6 where a lot of people leave off is at the verse that says, and take the sword of the Spirit and the helmet of salvation, which is the word of God, and it's like salute, there's the end. But the very next verse has a conjunction and it says, and praying in the Spirit. And so the issue there is that if we have that full armor of God and we've got all of our weaponry, defensive, offensive, we're good to go. But we have no communication with the heavenly headquarters. We've not prayed and asked God. We've not sought out direction. Then what will happen to that armor? What will happen to it? We'll drop it. We'll forget about it. We'll misuse it. And so to have that communication with God, that's where our direction comes from. And without it, the armor is only pieces. It's only parts. And the whole story, the whole picture can't be used until God gets a hold of all of it and gives us that direction. So that really is the part of praying in the Spirit that is so personal and intimate to me, because he doesn't leave us alone. Thank goodness, because I think I would go about pretty clunky with that full armor. Like it wouldn't suit me well not to have some direction.
All I can picture is like Monty Python with like the coconut horses. I love it. Well, I know in the class, because we talked about all of this when you were here. One of the things you're going to be talking through is your pray format that you talk about in the book. So we're not going to give all that away of exactly what it is, but maybe just tell them what pray stands for, and where they can find more of you, this book, this class, any pre-order bonuses you want them to know about. Let them know all of the things, because I'm telling you right now, everybody listening, I have gotten to see this class firsthand. We built it all, we mapped it all out together, and you do not want to miss this. So tell them all the things.
So that pray acrostic, yes, is just quickly, it's praise God, his power, remember his promises, then affirm his principles, and then yield the problem. So that's the quick little pray acrostic, but we're going to dive deep into that. I can't wait to share the class with all of you. And in order to get all the information about the book, you can go to desperateprayers.com. That is just the easiest, simple way to do it. The class will be right available at the top of that page, all that information, and then how to order the book, etc. As well as you can always go to rachelwojo.com. But if these things we've talked about today are where you want to go to follow up with what we've shared, then desperateprayers.com is the very best place.
Love it. Well, Rachel, thank you so much for being here, for giving us so much of your time, for being so vulnerable and pouring into our people with just so much heart, which is how you pour into every person who is lucky enough to come face to face with you, or, earbud to earbud with you, as the case may be. So thank you so much for being here. Friends, the book is Desperate Prayers, Embracing the Power of Prayer in Life's Darkest Moments. It is out everywhere books are sold October 8th, 1 week from today. But make sure you go hit up desperateprayers.com so you can get those pre-order bonuses, so you can get into that class, being a prayer warrior in dark times for your family. And make sure you go follow Rachel on Instagram if you want more of this kind of just real goodness poured into your life on a daily basis. Until next time, friends, this is The Mary Marantz Show.
Jesus said, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me, though he may die, he shall live. And whoever lives and believes in me shall never die. Do you believe this? Let us pray together. Jesus, save me. Forgive me for all my sins. I will follow you, Jesus. Now read your Bible. Pray continuously.